Well, hello again, and welcome back to the History of the Restoration Movement slideshow archives. This is module number 10, and in this module we will discuss church-state issues, particularly the difficulty that Christians experience when they have obligations to follow Christ's teachings on one hand, and to follow the needs of the government on the other. So we'll start this discussion with a look at one of Jesus' parables, followed up by a teaching of Paul. We will then go through just a short, and I mean very short, survey of how church-state issues have been dealt with in the past, and what specifically was new in the American milieu when the Restoration Movement first got off the ground. So, I would like to begin by noting this parable of Jesus. This parable is found in Matthew 13. And it reads like this. So Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. When the wheat had sprouted and formed heads, when the weeds also appeared. So the owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? So where did all these weeds come from?" The field owner replied, "An enemy has done this." The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered. "Because while you are pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat along with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds, tie them into bundles, and have them burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." There's a couple things that probably need to be noted with this. First is that Jesus, later in the chapter, gives a key to unlocking this parable. He first says that the person sowing the good seed is God, that the angels are the people who will be doing the reaping at the end of time, the person who is the enemy who sows the bad seed is Satan, but that does leave one group that is totally unaccounted for. And that would be, who are the servants? Who are the people who are saying, "Hey, Master, should we pull them up?" It's an interesting omission, and for a long time I wasn't quite sure what to make of it, although after much research based on the work of people like Gardner and others, I've come to the conclusion that the people asking the Master if they can pull the weeds up is the church itself. Because the church is realizing that weeds in their midst are problematic. That weeds may choke out good seed. And so they rightly ask, well, shouldn't we take care of this problem? And here's where the Master says something interesting. He says, no, because you may end up hurting the wheat when you get the weeds. And I would like to suggest, just off the bat, that since the age of Constantine, this has been a command, or at least a suggestion, that has been largely ignored by the church. That the church has routinely plucked its weeds, as it were. And frequently it has gotten a good share of, we'll call it, wheat along with them. And so that brings up a very interesting question. How do I, if I am a person who is a Christian and in the government, how do I respond to heresy? And I bring this up because Paul will write in his letter to the Romans in chapter 13, he will make this very strong warning against Christians who would desire to rebel against civil authority. Consequently, he writes, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. Those who do so will bring judgment upon themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from a fear of one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment upon wrongdoers. So, Paul gives a pretty straightforward assessment of what is the purpose of government. The purpose of a government is that they have been appointed by God to punish evil. That is their purpose. But this brings up a very interesting question. How does a Christian operate in a government context, especially if they are an elected official, and yet follow Jesus' parable to not pull up the weeds? Because it would seem that the purpose of the government in Paul's letter, especially his phrase where he says he does not bear the sword for no reason, is to just quite plainly say, if you mess with the government will kill you. And the government will be in the right. And likewise, he says, if you do evil, the government will be in the right to destroy you. So, just trying to hold this tension here real quick. On one side, Jesus is telling Christians, for he says this is what the kingdom of God is like. He is telling Christians, do not pull up the weeds yourself. Wait for the end time, and God will deal with it when the angels do the harvest. Paul says the purpose of a government is 24/7 to be punishing evil. So what happens when a Christian goes into the government? Which one do they follow? Which one is more pressing? So I'd like to just kind of conclude this opening salvo by just saying the problem of church-state relationships is that it is nearly impossible for the church to carry out its mission to leave the weeds alone, at least for the time being, and for the government to do its job of punishing the wicked consistently, if the church and the government are fused into a single entity. This is the basic problem of church-state in a nutshell. We have two different directives on how to deal with those who would do evil. Now, I've got this picture from last week's lessons of the heretics being burned. And I use that to bring up an interesting issue. When it comes to evil, what is the most evil thing you can think of? Most people would say some kind of murder, some kind of mass genocide. I would like to suggest that when the church was asking that question, they came up with a surprising answer. They said the worst thing any human being can do is to believe something that would cause another person to go to hell and teach that wherever they go. This is why the church feared heresy. Because if a person is teaching something that will literally cause a person to lose their salvation, that's worse than killing them. Because in a sense, you're killing them twice. You are having no respect for their body that is in the image of God by teaching them falsely. But even worse, once they have died, they will go to judgment, and because of a heretical teaching, God will say, I never knew you. Who are you? And it's all because a heretic told them the wrong thing. This is why the church will take heresy so seriously. And they'll pull a page straight out of Romans 13 for this. When the church and the government become fused into one single entity, they will reason the worst sin a person can commit is to be a heretic and to teach it. And if that is the worst sin a person can commit, and it is the government's job to punish wrongdoers with the sword, then can any punishment be bad enough? Be desperate enough? Can any punishment actually show the severity of this? And they would reason no. But this also brings up another interesting question, which is, how exactly did this state of affairs happen? How did the church, as founded by the apostles, become intermingled with the government in such a way that they even had to deal with this question? And to answer the second question, I would like to take a detour and ask another question. What do you think of when somebody says the word theocracy? Simply put, a theocracy comes from the word theo, meaning God, and ocracy, and the ocracy, which is a term meaning government. God government. Now, theocracies can manifest in many, many different ways, and they can manifest in both Christian and Jewish circles just as well as they can in pagan circles. And to kind of display this, we have three kind of opening pictures here. This first picture, here on the left, is a picture of Innocent III having a talk with John I of England. Now, in this picture, John I has crossed Innocent by signing the Magna Carta, granting many rights and privileges to his nobles, including compromising church lands. Now, Innocent is not going to take the compromising of church property lying down. So he is going to declare not just John, but all of England under what's called an interdict, meaning that no one can take communion from a Catholic priest until John repents. And here is a picture of just that. John coming before the Pope and saying, I repent. Because if John hadn't done this, very shortly a rebellion probably would have started in England. And John probably wouldn't have maintained his crown for much longer. And this, I just want to show, demonstrates the power that can be in a theocracy. That a person of the church, in this case Pope Innocent III, will wield enough power to make a king beg on his hands and knees for forgiveness. Now, again, I also pointed out that this does not necessarily have to be a Christian thing for it to be a theocracy. In places where church-state dynamics are much more solidified, for example, on the right, in the upper corner, we see a bas-relief from the Persian period. And in this bas-relief, we see several Persian kings. Specifically, there is the king Cyrus the Great on the left. And they are in between two cherubim, two winged creatures that often signify that there is a god in between them. And we see this in many ancient Near Eastern religions, where the king will be treated as a god. Specifically, the biggest would be in the land of Egypt, where the pharaoh pretty much can reign supreme as a god. Now, in the lower corner, we see a picture of a Baal worshiper approaching his king in Sidon. And he is petitioning the king to pray to Baal so that the rains will come at the proper time. Again, another example of a church, or we'll call it a priestly-oriented function, that has been taken on by a king. And in many ways, this is how theocracies tend to happen in the pagan world, where a king will take on priestly duties. So, if there is a couple take-home points, it would be this. In the ancient Near Eastern culture, the principle of theocracy is almost universally understood, that the gods rule the country, and that the king is, in some way, shape, or form, their divine appointee. And this will be a nearly ubiquitous role in religion, where the support of the state is accomplished by magic or spiritual power. And so the kings, especially in pagan areas, will surround themselves with magicians. They will surround themselves with priests who offer sacrifices to the various gods. And the king himself will take part in whatever rituals are necessary to ensure their rule. One of the more famous things that we find from the Persian period, for example, is that every year the king must get back to Babylon and grab the hands of the god Marduk, touch the actual idol in the temple. And they must do this at a ritual every year. Now, when the Babylonians were in power, this was also a ritual they partook in. And the last of the Babylonian kings, as described in Daniel chapter 5, Belteshazzar, will throw himself a little party. And, of course, he doesn't realize that the Persians are just right outside waiting to conquer things. But Belteshazzar is not the actual king at this time. It's actually a guy named Nabonidus. And Nabonidus has been neglecting his duty to take part in the Marduk ritual every year. Nabonidus is, in fact, actually totally out of the country in the desert of Arabia, practicing a pretty weird sort of religion to a moon god named Sin. And so what will happen? The Persians will come in. They will defeat Belteshazzar pretty soundly. And one of the first things they will do is complete the ritual where they have to touch Marduk's hands. Because they know that the people have been thinking for some time that their empire is struggling because we haven't done the right ritual. And frequently it will be the job of the king in order to make sure these rituals are obeyed. And I bring this up that this does not necessarily have to apply to just pagan kings. For example, even in the Bible, we see an example of King Ahab and his, we'll call her mischievous wife Jezebel. I'm feeling like giving her the benefit of the doubt for at the moment. But what we do know from the text is this, that Ahab and Jezebel have tried to introduce Baal worship into the northern kingdom of Israel. And of course, this is triggering all kinds of broken Mosaic laws left and right. But one of the biggest reasons why Ahab would do this is because if he is following the law of Moses, he has no way to act in a priestly fashion. For example, in 1 Samuel 13, King Saul actually finds himself in a world of hurt because he attempts to offer sacrifices. A little bit later from King Ahab's reign, we're going to see another king, Uzziah, will attempt to offer incense in the temple as per what the priests are allowed to do, and he will come down with leprosy. And so, in short, if you're a king in Israel, you really don't have much of a role in the priestly class or in the tabernacle. But if Ahab brings Baal into the northern kingdom, the king in Baalism has a very important role. The king is the chief intercessor for making it rain. The king prays to Baal, the storm god, and does the necessary rituals, and as a result, the rains come at a regular time. Now, of course, God won't stand for this, and God will send the prophet Elijah to deal with Ahab and Jezebel. And the first thing out of Elijah's mouth is to tell King Ahab that it will not rain until Elijah gives the word. And basically what this does is, in the minds of the people who worship Baal, this is a challenge directly to the king's power, because it is the king's job to intercede with Baal, at least according to the text known as the Baal cycle. And so what happens when the king fails in his prayer? Well, you have pretty much emasculated his ability to perform a theocracy. Now, moving on to a New Testament example, by the time of the Roman Empire, many of the Roman emperors will have picked up on a tradition that was started by Alexander the Great. Basically, Alexander the Great, after an extremely successful campaign, conquering most of the known world from Macedonia all the way to India, will start to ascribe to himself that he has to be a god. Who else could conquer so much territory? Well, it wasn't a very peaceful existence, though, for Alexander. And the territories he conquered will soon find themselves struggling over pretty much perpetual war for several centuries. However, when Augustus Caesar becomes the first of the Roman Caesars, an interesting thing will start, which is often known as the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. And with this will come security and prosperity. And the Roman emperor, and any of the emperors that come after Augustus Caesar, will start taking a lot of credit for this peace and prosperity. And they will begin what is known as the Caesar cult, where offerings and incense will be burned to Caesar, thanking him for this beautiful Pax Romana the world is enjoying. And several titles will go with this that we will start calling Caesar Kurios, or Lord, Soter, or Savior. In addition, we will also use other terms like Redeemer and Liberator. Sometimes they'll even go so far as to call them Divine, or a Son of God, or just simply God. Well, I'm sure you can tell where this is going. In Christianity, we offer a counter narrative to this Roman idea of the Caesar cult. Who truly brings about the kingdom of peace in Christianity? Is it Caesar? Or is it Jesus? Who truly can make the claim to the term Lord? Caesar or Jesus? What about Savior? And while explicitly terms like Redeemer and Liberator are not, at least the way that the Romans would have understood them, are found in the New Testament, it doesn't take much to note that these are terms that could equally apply to Jesus as well. And certainly the term Son of God is one of the more provocative terms that gets used when referring to Jesus. And so all of this is simply to say that frequently the Christian religion and Judaism before it will seek to undermine pagan theocracies. And instead they will want to replace it with a theocracy of God in the Old Testament, and a theocracy of God and his anointed one in the New. So this will bring up an interesting problem for the Caesars, particularly Constantine, because he will be the first to become a Christian in 311 AD. And when he becomes a Christian, he's pretty much has to navigate what is his role as emperor in this church cult or this church religion. Because what Caesar, or specifically Constantine, has to navigate is that the Romans are very used to their Caesars taking the status of a god or a son of God. Well, what do you do when even Caesar himself is claiming that Jesus is Son of God? All of a sudden, the emperors can't use that name if they're going to continue being Christian. But the other issue is, because the Caesars are so wrapped up in the state religion, the question will become, once Christianity becomes the state religion, how will Caesars interact with that? Will they continue their high priestly duties just as they did when they were in paganism over Christianity? One could make an argument that according to the book of Hebrews, there is no one who can perform a high priestly duty but Christ himself. But in attempting to navigate this, the take-home point for this is Constantine himself will attempt to take we'll call it a secular priestly duty. He will never actually become a bishop, or he will never become a priest himself. But he will continue to use an older Roman term called Pontifex Maximus. Literally means the chief bridge builder. And this term is often used in reference to the first among a civil group who has the job of acting as priest for this civil religion. And so, in short, Constantine will try to exert a pretty strong amount of control over the church. And this is often referred to by the term Caesaro-Papism, where the Caesar or king or the government tries to control the church from a position of secular authority. Well, eventually the Roman Empire in the West will fall. The Roman emperors will be replaced by Germanic kingdoms that are infiltrating the Italian peninsula and the Iberian peninsula. And before you know it, we really have no one wielding the power of a Caesar in Italy. And what will happen is the Roman bishops will begin garnering a lot of that power. Basically, they will start filling that power vacuum. Now, unlike the Caesars, the Roman bishops are actually church men. And one of these early Caesars, a pope named Gelasius, will write a treatise where he will articulate what is known as the two-sword theory. And this will specifically pertain to church-government relations. Now, Gelasius will say that earthly governments, according to Romans 13, are authorized to wield the physical sword. But Gelasius will also say that the church is authorized to wield the spiritual sword, quoting Ephesians 6, the armor of God. There is the sword of the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And Gelasius will note that the sword that the church uses is used to combat the demonic realms. It is used to combat heresy. It is used to combat false religions and false doctrines. And while the physical sword may actually kill people in real time, it is the spiritual sword that, again, to quote another passage from Matthew 16, that is able to bind and loose on earth and in heaven. And so coincidentally, Gelasius will start to assert that the spiritual sword is much more important than the physical sword. And as a result, many popes after him will begin to dominate Western European politics. So how profound does this domination get? Well, by 1077, we will see a pope who is actually so powerful that he is able to actually challenge an emperor directly. Now, at this time, there is this thing known as the Holy Roman Empire, which is different from the Old Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is actually a Frankish and Germanic kingdom, while the Old Roman Empire was an Italian empire. So, the Holy Roman Empire is a Germanic, Frankish kingdom. And at the head of this kingdom is an emperor named Henry IV. Now, Henry at this time is going to try to control the appointment of the bishops in Germany. And he's going to do this because he feels that he wants to maintain the right kind of people in power positions, including in the church. Now, Gregory VII, who is the Pope at the time, he won't stand for this. And he will excommunicate Henry, and he will also tell every one of Henry's nobles, or vassals, that they no longer have to be loyal to their oath to Henry. Basically meaning he says, hey, Henry cannot take communion anymore. He is no longer a Christian until I say otherwise. You can go ahead and take the reins of the Holy Roman Empire if you're strong enough to do it. So in short, Henry IV is going to almost lose his kingdom because Gregory is basically going to say, I revoke your ability to even be Christian. And the historical documents note that Henry basically had to go meet up with Gregory in his winter castle, and Henry supposedly had to beg in the snow as a beggar for about 3 days before Gregory actually forgave him and lifted the excommunication, allowing Henry to get his throne back. But just notice the power there. Unlike Caesaro-Papism, where a king or emperor is controlling the church, this is where the church is directly controlling a king. And this would be a theocracy. Technically, there are two terms, and we'll discuss them a little bit lower, but by all intents and purposes, this is a theocracy that Gregory VII can claim to speak directly for God, and he can force secular rulers to obey. So let's look at those definitions here real quick, because I want you to note that there's a slight difference between a state church and a church state. In a state church, the rulers, the government, has control over the church leadership. And this is often called Caesaro-Papism, because the king, or Caesar, is trying to control the church. So think of that. When state comes before church, Caesar comes before the Pope. Now, in a church state, a clergyman will exert control over a king or rule directly. And in these cases, there's really kind of two brands of this. If the clergyman claims to be either a prophet or claims the ability to speak for God himself, this is rightly called a theocracy. But if the clergyman can only claim to be ruling as a spiritual head and he is not receiving new divine revelation, the technical term for this is an ecclesiocracy, meaning the church is controlling the government. Whereas in a theocracy, a prophet or a man claiming to speak for God is controlling the secular government. Now, if we can scan ahead a couple hundred years, a very interesting thing happens in 1791. This brief paragraph becomes the law of the land as the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. This amendment was penned by James Madison and relies heavily on the Virginia Bill of Rights, which has a non-establishment clause as well. Here is what James Madison wrote, and this is what the 13 colonies approved as the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right for the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, what is extremely unique about this is that the idea that the government cannot declare a state religion is an extremely novel concept. Quite frankly, you're really not going to find this almost anywhere else in the world during this time, with the one exception being France after the French Revolution. Otherwise, this idea that Congress is prohibited from making a state religion will be unheard of at this time. But I'd also like to point out that there is something that is missing from this that is often highly argued when we start talking the politics of the First Amendment. And that is, you'll notice that in this actual text, which is all that's actually in the Bill of Rights, and thus it's all that's in the Constitution, you'll notice that there is no mention of the idea of a wall or a wall of separation between the church and the state. And that's because the idea of a wall of separation between church and state didn't actually get penned until January 1st of 1802, almost 11 years after the ratification of the Bill of Rights. And specifically, it didn't come from James Madison, the author. It came from James Madison's friend and current president at the time, Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson is going to receive a letter from the Danbury Baptist Association. And the Baptist Association is going to write him a nice friendly letter praising his first year in office. But then they will ask a question where they basically say, we're kind of afraid that the First Amendment is a little vague. And we're afraid that someone will try to basically force a state religion on us. Now, Baptists are thinking this because at the time they are still pretty much a minority party as far as other denominations go. Now, Jefferson is going to reply to this, and his reply is interesting. It goes like this. Believing with the Danbury Baptist Association that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or for his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only, and not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or prohibit the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the right of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of these sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced that he has no natural right in opposition to his social duty. Now, just kind of taking that apart real quick, you'll notice that firstly, it is Jefferson who interprets this idea that there should be a wall between the two, meaning that neither should really have the ability to affect the other. Meaning that the First Amendment not only regulates a state church. It also regulates the possibility of a church state. In addition to this, I note that he basically says, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of these sentiments. And to me, that basically says that it will be his duty to make sure that this becomes an interpretation of the First Amendment that sticks. And I'd like to point out that he has done an extremely successful job, because almost any law that comes before the Supreme Court that deals with whether or not something violates the Establishment Clause, this will be one of the go-to texts to help unpack what was meant by the First Amendment. I'd also like to note that this is somewhat out of character for Jefferson, because Jefferson, as a Jeffersonian, obviously, believes in strict constructualism of the Constitution, meaning that if something isn't in the Constitution, in order to change it, you would have to make an amendment. But here he is advocating an interpretation specifically of this idea of a wall of church and between church and state, and that he is going to attempt with as best he can to enforce this interpretation without necessarily making it the law of the land. Again, I find this to be an interesting, somewhat about-face. And we're going to see Jefferson do this several times during his presidency, where Jefferson will have the chance to basically pass an amendment, but instead he will just go with his gut and legislate without necessarily asking whether or not he has the constitutional power to do so. So, if you're asking what's going to be the take-home, what's on the test per se, it would be this. It is the thesis of this section that the First Amendment to the Constitution very radically changed the way that governments and religious organizations view one another. Before the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, nearly all countries, Christian countries or otherwise, operated with the fundamental assertion that there is a symbiotic link between the church and the state. And with this development of the First Amendment, churches could no longer rely on government sanction or federal tax dollars to bolster or propagate the faith. In short, because they were no longer getting government aid, churches had to fend for themselves in many ways. And this actually proved to be a very strong builder for churches in America, because they were not getting tax dollars anymore. They were forced to evangelize. They were forced to take their pastoral roles seriously. In short, because they didn't have an endless stream of cash coming from tax dollars, they had to get out and evangelize. And this will become extremely obvious in the early 1800s. But it does have a certain negative to it as well. And the negative is that the wall does go both ways in Jefferson's mind. And this wall would keep a church from exercising its, we'll call it, moral prerogatives, and holding those people in the government accountable to those. So, in short, the First Amendment changes the way most countries, or at least it changed the way that the United States viewed government and church. And this is radically different from almost any other country in the world at the time. So, what are our conclusions? Well, first, church-state relationships are often very complicated. They often revolve around the use of spiritual power, and the use of spiritual power specifically to benefit the government or the state. And because of this, they are prone to manipulation from both sides. The church wanting to use this spiritual power to control the state, and the state wanting to control the church so that they may claim the use of this spiritual power. And so, as long as the two are intertwined, it will often become a wrestling match for the spiritual power, whatever is believed to be the spiritual power of the church. And well up until the Renaissance, it was believed that the church was extremely spiritually powerful. It will only be after the Renaissance that we start to see a decline in the belief of supernatural power ascribed to the church. Well, another conclusion is that it is really only in the modern era that we see governments taking steps to disestablish state churches. And they do so with the understanding that either one or both sides of this relationship should not be able to influence the other. And in most cases, they want there to be no connection between the two, that a church should not be able to influence the state, at least at a theocracy level, and that the state cannot sponsor a church, at least at the Caesaro-Papism level. But a third conclusion is that the Restoration movement is born right in the middle of this development. As people are finally beginning to breathe the air of freedom that goes with the First Amendment, the Restoration movement will have its first birthdays. And I would like to suggest that this idea of separation of church and state will profoundly influence the Restoration movement. So much so that any church that has a hierarchy, for example, Presbyterians will have the Synod and the General Assembly. Episcopalians will have a single bishop. Methodists will have a single bishop. That any of these groups that have a strong hierarchy, Restoration movement people and the writings they produce will tend to mock these organizations as governments, even though they don't have any tie to the United States government per se. The Restoration movement will note the similarities between a church government and the civil government, and that they will take a lot of the rhetoric we see in the First Amendment and apply it to the church. And this may be one of the reasons why the Restoration movement will so strongly advocate what is known as congregational polity, that individual congregations are under no rule of law except to be ruled by themselves.